Make some adjustments. All right. Oh, my hair is getting too long. I need a haircut.
Yeah.
All righty. Hey, everybody, just jumping on. We'll get started in a few minutes. You know the drill by now. Get the Hurricane U logo. There we go. Nice. One more. Hey, Michael Hurd. Thanks for being moderator today, buddy. All right. Okay. Oh. Da-da-da. Hi. We'll get started in just a moment, everybody. I'm going to wait just a couple more minutes for people to jump on as they see the link posted throughout social media. We shall get started. So, Dan, real quick, is Lixian's departure now opening up a position at National Hurricane Center, or was it already filled, or what?
It will. We'll have a new senior hurricane specialist. So there's essentially 6 senior specialists So Lexington was one, and it'll open up another position there.
Gotcha. All right. Let's get started, shall we? It's 4 past the hour. All right, here we go. Hello, everybody. I am Mark Sudd with HurricaneTrack.com, and welcome to another live broadcast of the Hurricane U series, where we try to educate you about different topics related to hurricanes, whether it be the hurricane hunters, we talked about that, to global patterns and long-range forecasting, the MJO. We discussed that topic with Ben Knoll a few weeks ago, and today we're going to dig into a very specific, and for me, one of my favorite topics when we talk about hurricanes, and that is National Hurricane Center forecast products, how to best utilize those products, and what I mean by that, the public advisory, the forecast advisory, maybe the discussion, and then the other graphics that have come along. A lot has changed even since I have been doing this, going back more than 25 years, and really just the last 10 years we have seen a lot of changes with National Hurricane Center products and services. And so the best way to address all of these topics is to bring on an expert, and I've done that. If we can get the iPad, one day I'm going to figure this out to where it works seamlessly. There he is. So today's expert is Daniel Brown, and he is a forecaster at the National Hurricane Center. And so I'm going to just start it off with, welcome, Dan. Tell us a little bit about yourself, where you came to Miami from, and we'll roll on from there. Welcome.
Thanks, Mark. Glad to be on today. Yeah, I've been at the Hurricane Center since 1993. Started there right out of school. Went to University of North Carolina, Asheville. Grew up in North Carolina, born in Florida. Moved to the western part of North Carolina when I was in elementary school, and continued all my schooling there. And then been at the Hurricane Center now for a while. Started out at the Hurricane Center in the Tropical Analysis and Forecast branch, which is, they do a lot of marine forecasting, do the Dvorak technique for the hurricane forecasters. Worked at a really short time for the local National Weather Service office in Miami, but since 2006, I've been in the Hurricane Specialist Unit, and about the last 11 or 12 of those years has been one of the senior hurricane specialists.
Very good. Well, we appreciate you joining us today, and we're going to talk about something that, again, I think it's all the way back to when I was a kid, and I would see, even in the days when Neil Frank would be on TV or Bob Sheets talking about different aspects of hurricane forecasting. It was just always fascinating. And then in the age of the internet, for me, which really came around in the mid-1990s, I specifically remember the year 1995 when I graduated college, that I was able to access the internet in its early days there, pretty much unrestricted at the library at school. It wasn't until 1997 that I got my own computer, a Windows computer, and just being able to go to the National Hurricane Center website and read those forecasts, read the discussions, read all the different literally written words that you all were putting out. I loved it, and it really taught me a lot, and there's a lot in there. So that's why we're here today, is to talk about those products and how they have changed. All right, so let's start at the top. When we have a tropical cyclone out there, depression, storm, hurricane, and now, of course, we have the potential tropical cyclone, the public advisory seems to be the go-to, and that's where we'll start, product that I understand through the training I've had through the National Hurricane Conference that was made, I guess, for the media more or less, almost like a rip and read. So let's start with the public advisory, and while you discuss that, I'm going to pull it up, just an example from a past event,
Sure.
And we'll go from there. So the public advisory, that's where we start.
Yeah, so, like you said, public advisory, essentially a more basic product. As you mentioned, it was kind of interpreted or first used for the rip and read, for the first on the radio, television, It has largely really been unchanged for the last, I would say, 40, 50 years. We've got a collection of some older ones at the Hurricane Center. And again, same type format with the headline. And then it talks about where the storm's located. We did make some tweaks to that about 10 years ago just to make the section headers stand out a little bit more and maybe try to increase the readability of some of it, and also kind of move the format. With the thinking then was to have the little summary block that used to be at the bottom of the product, but put that up at the very top,
Right,
where folks can get the latitude, longitude, the distance from a well-known location, the intensity, the pressure right at the top of the product. Of course, it has the headline,
right,
which is really the most key takeaway we want from that advisory. And then it has a section on really the 48-hour kind of, or maybe 72 hours now,
right.
the motion, intensity of where the storm we think it's going to go, if we think it's going to strengthen or weaken. And then there's a section on the hazards, and those hazards are broken down by type, and we try to put whatever hazard we think is the most significant at the top of that section. So oftentimes you'll see that storm surge block mentioned first, then it may be wind, rainfall, and then
Right.
we get various other hazards. But again, it's this product's looking at more kind of that 50,000 foot view, the large scale picture. Oftentimes, if you want to get into the more details at local level, that's where we get into some of the local office National Weather
Right.
Service products that are issued by our local WFOs.
So the public advisory has evolved over the years. I know it's gotten fuller, is a good way to describe it. Content has been added to it, as you talked about there. So for the general public, what should they take away from the public advisory as being the most important pieces? I don't think there's just any one piece. It was just called pieces of information. When you pull up the public advisory and you're going to read it, what do you really want people to take away from that? There's a lot there now. So what's the most important pieces of that puzzle there that they can glean from it?
Yeah, some of your viewers may be folks that are more enjoy some of the meteorology behind the forecast, and that really is in the discussion.
Right.
And I'm sure we'll talk about
Right.
that. But this product here is, again, we have some folks at the Hurricane Center that are FEMA liaisons, and they take some of this and make situational awareness reports for some of the FEMA folks, or maybe from state and local emergency managers. So that's one way we see people using it, is take that information about, again, where it's located, what the headline of that advisory is.
Right.
And then it's a little bit of the information about where's it going to go, is it going to get stronger, and then again, that hazard information, at least for the big picture, what we're looking at regarding storm surge, rainfall. That really, I think, is the most pertinent information out of the public advisory.
Yeah, and the one that I'm looking at here as an example is the 11 a.m. August 29th for Dorian, and the headline was Dorian moving northwestward, and then I guess there's two headlines, and the next one is expected to strengthen during the next couple of days, and then of course you've got your summary of your basic information, the lat long, the winds, the pressure, etc., and then watches and warnings, which at the time there were not any up at the moment, the discussion and outlook section, and then I think for me, I just love this, and when it came to being, is the hazards affecting land. And not to challenge your memory too much, but do you remember when that was added to the public advisory? I don't know the answer, so I'm not quizzing you, but when was hazards affecting land put in there?
So we've always had the section to describe the hazards, but again, it was about 2007 or 8 that we actually added those section headers.
Gotcha.
And so we had the hazards affecting land as a way to say, there are always hazards in a hurricane. If you're a ship at sea, there's always going to be wind and high
Right.
seas. But again, we didn't want to repeat that every single time for a product that's geared toward the general public. So that's why we put that header in as hazards affecting land. And again, a hurricane can be, like Lorenzo last year, out into the open ocean,
Right.
but it still may be having hazards that, large swells,
Sure.
producing rip currents that we still want to talk about affecting land. So you'll see us do that even for those open ocean storms.
And coincidentally, and I truly did just choose this at random, I chose Dorian because of the high impact nature, of course, but your last name is at the bottom. It says Forecaster Brown. And I bring that up because I want people to understand that while there is formatting to this that's already in place. There's a template, etc. That these are written by people just like that guy right there. That's Forecaster Brown. And that's what I wanted to bring into this discussion today, is that people to understand that this is not generated by bots, so to speak. We hear a lot about bots in our social media world and automatic scripts and whatever, that when it says Forecaster Brown, that's who we're talking about right there. And so the specialist, the Hurricane Center specialist, and whatever seniority they have, those are the people behind these forecasts. So if you would, talk about the procedure here, that you don't just sit in there by yourself in a bubble and say, all right, what am I going to do today? There's a process involved, isn't it? And I think it's fascinating. If you could describe that, please.
Yeah, Mark, that's very true. You know, there are 10 of us at the Hurricane Center that are in the Hurricane Specialist Unit. It's primarily those of us that are the ones making the forecast. A few extra folks in the office that can help fill in from time to time. But you'll see our names at the bottom of those products. As you mentioned, it is not a automated process. Again, we are controlling where that track is going to be put. We are making that intensity forecast, and we are also, very importantly, crafting those messages.
Right.
It's about a 3-hour process from beginning to end. So we start right around each synoptic time, and by that I mean 0Z, 6Z, 12Z, and 1800 Z or Zulu time. And that equates to basically 8 a.m., 2 p.m., 8 p.m., and 2 a.m. here in the Eastern time zone.
Right.
And it's at those times that we start the forecast. So we usually get estimates of where the storm is located via satellite from both the Tropical Analysis and Forecast branch at the Hurricane Center, the Satellite Analysis branch up in Washington, D.C. area. They provide estimates of how strong it is based on our Dvorak technique. If we have an airplane, that's when we're getting those aircraft fixes in. And it's at that point we determine where the storm's located, how big and how strong. Then we initialize our computer model guidance. And again, most of those models take hours to run, so we're actually using those previous cycles of those models, but it's interpolating into that position that we gave it to say this is where the starting point is now.
Right.
That's where you see those spaghetti models get created. And then it's the forecaster really sitting down and actually, again, making those forecasts. We're clicking on those points. It is a human that's doing that. We're trying to also provide the consistency from forecast to forecast. The models can do this back and forth, but it's the human that's also trying to provide that consistency in the forecast. It does oftentimes play to our advantage to make those adjustments slowly, as we do see the models swing back and forth. After the track forecast is made, it is sitting there looking at the intensity forecast. And then once that's done, we also do a size forecast, and that does play a role in when we need to issue watches and warnings and where those warnings are placed. And then once all that's done is when we really then sit down and craft the message.
Right.
There's a conference call that occurs about an hour before each advisory is released with our local National Weather Service offices. That's where we coordinate the watches and warnings and all the various hazards. And then again, it gives the specialist about 30 to 45 minutes then to create the discussion and the public advisory. And as you said, the public advisory comes out in a nice template for us, but we are having to add the wording, add the hazard information, add the headline. And again, in my time there, I feel like it's gotten, as you said, so many more people read these products, see the product, that it really has become a lot more about the messaging and making sure we're getting that messaging right. Usually we have another specialist or our branch chief, Dr. Mike Brennan. Others are reading it and providing critique, if there's time. Sometimes the time can get pretty short to do that, but again, we're trying to quality control before they go out the door. And it's one person with their name on the bottom. Sometimes it's a little bit more of a joint effort with a couple folks contributing as well.
And that's the point here, is that that's a staff down there, and it's amazing. And over the years, as I grew up and then I got into college and in my early years of my career, I remember seeing those names. And, back in the day, it would be like Mayfield, Rappaport, Lawrence, and, I thought, and Stewart. And I thought, I got to meet these people one day. They were, That's 4 right there. Right? So that's like the Beatles to me. That's my Beatles, right? And I think people that are really into tracking hurricanes, it's a very similar thing, that these people become almost celebrities to us. And so over the years, being able to learn from you all, both from the products and then, of course, from conferences like the National Hurricane Conference, where there's actually courses. Anybody ever interested, once we can start conferences again, hopefully next year, the National Hurricane Conference is a great opportunity. You can actually take hurricane planning and you learn from these folks there, and I did just that. All right, so public advisory, we've talked about that, and we could probably talk about each of these subsections for an hour at a time, honestly, because there's so much history. But I do want to move on because we do have a lot to cover. So let's delve into now the forecast advisory. And I believe it's got, let's see, it is just called the forecast advisory, right? Didn't it used to be the marine or something as well? Yeah.
That's correct. It actually, the initials for that product coding is TCM, Tropical Cyclone Marine Advisory. We really simply now call it the forecast advisory because it serves a lot more purpose. Originally, it was used by a lot of the mariners to be able to plot and look at the forecast. Now the plotting, of course, is done by computers.
Right.
And so it is the product that helps drive our graphics at the Hurricane Center, drives a lot of folks' graphics, and also drives programs like HurricaneTrack. And that's a program that is sponsored by FEMA's National Hurricane Program, and provides emergency managers with a picture and tools to help with their evacuation decision making. And so again, it's really the one product that you're going to get all of the forecast information. It contains the current forecast, all the various forecast points, the size of the storm in radii. I will mention that those radii basically mean that that's the maximum extent, and each quadrant doesn't necessarily mean those winds are blowing everywhere, but the maximum extent as we analyze it. One thing that's in that product a lot of people don't know is too, it does include the eye size when there's an eye, and also there is an information there about how confident we are in the current initial position. There is a uncertainty that we put in is subjective, but again, if the storm has an eye, we're pretty confident knowing where that location is. So it might only be with off by 5 plus or minus 5 to 10 nautical miles, but if it's a system that is still in the formative stage, we might say we only know good within about 30 or 40 miles of where that center is located.
And it's interesting, and if you caught that, he mentions that the automatic tracking programs, apps, television, in most cases, there's a computer language and it's called scraping. They'll scrape the advisory, this product, and scrape out the numbers. And so, you remember Hurricane Pro. They no longer do that anymore. Hurricane HD. That's where this would come from. And a lot of the automatic tracking, like he talked about the HurricaneTrack program, that is coming from this particular product because it's formatted in a certain way so that machine language learning, or not learning, but this is why I don't code. Levi's site, Levi Cowan at Tropical Tidbits, the Weather Nerds folks. This is that product that gets scraped. If you know computers better than I do, that's a lot of where this comes from, and I think that's fascinating. And so the formatting here really hasn't changed all that much over the last 10 years or so. Would I be right about that? Because you can't break the computers.
You're correct. We've had some discussion about making it a more tabular format.
Right.
We've been thinking about that perhaps as we at some point maybe introduce a 6 and 7 day forecast. But we would probably do it in tandem with the current one,
right? So
that we wouldn't break things right away,
right?
But one thing that is new this year is we're actually going to add a 60-hour forecast to the product. So folks will see now a forecast of both track and intensity at the 60-hour mark. Normally, or previously, it was a forecast at 12, 24, 36, 48 hours, then it skipped all the way to 72, 96, and 120 or day 5. Now you're actually going to get that 60-hour forecast point. Then it's going to go to day 3, 4, and 5.
So maybe we won't see the need as often to say something about, although not explicitly whatever between this hour and that hour. It could be a hurricane in there. That might help to reduce that a little bit, that 60-hour point. I remember.
Exactly. No, you got it exactly. That 60-hour point is really it is kind of a crucial time because it's just beyond that watch time period.
Right.
So having that 60-hour point might be helpful for some decision makers as we get closer to landfall. Again, having that, because you're right. Sometimes you have the 40-hour point still offshore, 72 hours would now be well inland, and you really couldn't infer from the product exactly what we thought would be its intensity around landfall. Now you'll have that 60-hour point that might be helpful.
I think it'll actually be very helpful. So you guys understand that there's going to be a 60-hour point now, and I think that could be really big, especially if something. Well, obviously, I think the best benefit will be when something is approaching land, that we won't have that gap in there. And I know many times, I'm trying to figure it out between 48 and 72. And you're interpreting the heading, and all right, so especially if it's recurving, it's like where. I know you're not supposed to follow the black line, but some people do because we need to know exactly where to put equipment and whatever. And trying to get that interpretation between here and here, it's filling in the spaces, right? The blank spaces on a map, as it were. So I applaud that. I think that's going to be great. 2 thumbs up from me.
And it will be used in our wind speed probability calculations and also the storm surge modeling that we do. So again, should help those techniques as well. Yeah, the utility of it, I think, is going to be very advantageous. All right, let's move along. We are talking, by the way, if you're just joining in, with Daniel Brown from the National Hurricane Center about the various products and services, right? You guys do provide a heck of a service. Yeah. And related to tropical cyclone advisories. And so the next one here, and this is really my favorite, is the forecast discussion. I'm just going to pick another random one. 5 p.m. Saturday, August 31st last year for Dorian. And again, just to mention, all right, so this one has, settle a bet for me real quick. Because you knew the guy longer than I did, and I've only met him a handful of times. How do you say Lixian's last name? I say Avila. Avila. I always said Avila. I was wrong. Lixian Avila. All right. Anyway, well, now I know. And if my recollection is correct, I worked the shift after Lixian. I think that Saturday evening.
Oh, okay.
If I'm not mistaken. That was the evening that Dorian was rapidly strengthening, I believe.
Yes, absolutely. Shouldn't smirk at it because that was, well, at least it was still out over the open water there when it did so. But yes, we remember that very well. So at the bottom again, it says that we have 2 folks here. This is Avila Lixian. He's since retired. You might have seen that on social media that Lixian has retired and he'll be enjoying some much needed free time. But back August 31st of last year, it says Avila and Brennan at the bottom. So 2 people involved in putting this together. Dorian, a major hurricane at this point. So that means, again, they wrote this. I don't know who I guess Lixian was probably the lead author or whatever. And we can get into those details of why there are 2 names. But again, this is written and sculpted by a person. And in this case, Lixian Avila, okay, with the help of Michael Brennan. And so it's not computer generated. I want people to thoroughly understand that these are just not like a 45-day forecast that you see in an app somewhere that's just taking raw GFS guidance or something. And it's like, and my wife does this to me all the time. 2 weeks out, whatever, want to go somewhere. I say, there's an MJO coming, might be some activity, whatever. She goes, well, the app says it's going to be sunny and 90 degrees. I'm like, that's not a human interpreting that. That's raw. Story for another day, but it just drives me nuts. This is sculpted by people here, all right? So, and I keep hammering that because I want you folks to understand that that's what's going on here. Some very brilliant people are helping to put this stuff together. That being said, tell us all about the forecast discussion, my favorite product.
Yeah, so this is the product that we really can try to communicate what the certainty or uncertainty is in the forecast. So typically you'll see us start, the format I like to use is talk about the current satellite appearance of the storm, current structure of the storm,
Sure.
The data that's gone into the reasoning for its intensity estimate, how strong it is, and then from there it's either talking about the track or the intensity. And for me, it kind of varies on which one I want to talk about next. And again, we'll talk about the models to some degree, and then again, steering features when it comes to track, what the environmental conditions are regarding whether it's going to be favorable, what the wind shear is, sea surface temperatures, moisture profile, things like that. We'll talk about talk about intensity. But then we may talk about, again, if it's a particular case in which there's a lot of model spread, we might talk about that we're not as confident as normal in that forecast. Or perhaps we'll talk about some alternate scenarios. If the storm stays south or north of some landmass, maybe it's going to be weaker or stronger than predicted. And then, again, with the intensity, I don't think we're ever extremely confident in intensity forecast. We're getting better at intensity forecast. But again, we try to explain that as well. And then more recently, in probably the past 5 years, you'll see us with these key messages in that product. And that came out actually around the time of Hurricane Joaquin, when there was a tremendous amount of uncertainty in the forecast. We decided to include some messages about that uncertainty and how it might affect the U.S. or may not. And so we've got a lot of great feedback about that, and we try to do that now. We actually take those key messages now and also create a graphic for social media. But those key messages tend to talk about, again, the uncertainty, what folks should be doing, especially the longer lead times. It might be too early to pinpoint the exact hazards and location, but we can start telling people, hey, it's time to start thinking about getting your hurricane plan ready.
Sure.
And then, as the event gets closer, we can talk more specific about those hazards. And then as you get into the watch warning period is really then we can, start to pinpoint areas that we get really concerned about for storm surge, wind, and rainfall.
Well, one thing that I've noticed is that, and for those of us that follow this as religiously as I do, we see y'all's, my southern drawl, personality. We can read your personalities in these discussions, and oftentimes we can even know who wrote it just by looking at the length of it. And if there's more paragraphs, we can start, well, that's probably so-and-so, so-and-so, and so-and-so. And the way things are worded, Dr. Jack Bevan, he'll talk about that, an alternative scenario or whatever, and you just start to pick up on those things. And that's more of the nuances here that we that are really into this follow and have learned over the years. But the utility of that product, though, is what's so important. And the thing that I learned from the National Hurricane Conference when I first started, I think that the first one I went to was 1999 in Orlando, and I took the hurricane planning course. And it might have been Stacy Stewart that taught me this, is that it was the discussion was your opportunity to get inside the head of the forecaster. What are they thinking? And so instead of just following some kind of a list or just it gives you there's the opportunity for interpretation, that it's not just strict, here's what the models say, here's what's happening, and blah 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 blah. There's more of an opportunity for you all to discuss scenarios, to discuss the appearance of it, and truly get inside Daniel Brown's head, Dr. Bevan's head, Stacy's head, etc. Say these guys, I know them personally, so forgive me, but I thought that was fascinating, that it wasn't just, you got to follow this format, and if you stray from it, you're out of here. There was a way to really know, okay, there is some more concern. You can see that the meteorologist there is also a person. And you can see the concern growing because of what they're writing, that it's not just some scripted, formatted piece. I always thought that was fascinating, and we've learned a lot from it over the years. So that being said, the format really hasn't changed much, but you did add the what'd you call it? The main talking points, the key messages, right?
Yep.
Who was the director in 15? I don't remember. It wasn't still Bill Reed, was it?
It was.
Can't remember. It's like bad.
No, it was Rick.
Dr. Nab in 2015. That's
Rick
right.
Nab, yes.
Right. Sorry, I couldn't remember. But I
Rick
remember
Nab
Joaquin.
started,
Right.
Yep. It was 2012 to about 2018.
Gotcha. Right. So Bill.
Yeah.
Okay. So because I remember Joaquin, one of those ones where most of the guidance was suggesting that turn back towards the United States, maybe the Mid-Atlantic, and then the European was kind of off. And there was a tremendous amount of uncertainty. So would you say then, I guess, as you alluded to, maybe that's where the birth of the key messaging was Joaquin? That's amazing.
Yeah, it was. Again, there was so much uncertainty in that particular forecast. There were going to be impacts from rainfall, regardless of the track, across portions of the Carolinas.
Right.
So there was just a lot more to really have to talk about there. It's funny you talk about all the forecasters and different styles. I'll have to admit that sometimes I don't think mine are quite as much flair as some others. But then, and we're certainly losing one of the best with Lixian in his retirement. He added a lot of personal anecdotes and flair to his discussions over time. And we again, I think everyone writes great discussions, and we're trying to get that message through. But you're right, there is a personal side to a lot of them. And I think we all take pride in writing those discussions because again, it is our chance to really talk about what's going on, and then at least for myself and the others, it's our one chance to really help folks communicate. If they're a television meteorologist, if you're the folks in media and others, emergency management, they're trying to now communicate the forecast. I think it can help them get an understanding again of that uncertainty. What are we certain about and what are we uncertain about in the forecast?
Yeah, getting into the nuts and bolts of why the public advisory says what it says, or why the forecast advisory has the forecast there. That's that opportunity there, that forecast discussion. And I've used it very often when I do a video blog. We'll just break it down paragraph by paragraph and then go try to find different elements of what is being talked about. And if there's, as an example, if there's a discussion piece about that the hurricane is approaching high upper ocean heat content, well, we can go find a map that shows that from the HRD AOML site, and we can look at that and then explain what that means, why it's important. Like I said, I love the discussion. It's been my favorite. It's interesting. Here's a tidbit for you all. Speaking of tropical tidbits, here's one for you. 5 cents to Levi for that term. Or maybe 50 cents. It's so good. You remember, of course you do, that it used to say on the discussion, for intergovernmental use only. Do you know why it said that and when that changed? I know the why part's maybe a little obvious, but when did policy change that was it just inevitable because of the internet? But you remember it used to say that. It was almost like a secretive.
It's real funny you mention that because I wasn't going to let you leave the subject without saying that myself because I don't think a lot of people knew that. And
I almost forgot.
I probably started there right around the tail end of that still being on the product. Again, I think it really changed with the internet age, having a website, having more accessibility to the product for the general public. Again, it was originally intended for a product that was either for meteorologists or for others in the weather service to, again, understand the thinking. It wasn't nearly as long back then either. It was much shorter than it is today. But again, I want to say it changed kind of in the early to mid 1990s when it took that off. And again, that was right around the time the Hurricane Center introduced a website.
Right.
And it was probably a year or two after that. Folks started reading it and they were like, "Why does it say that?" So then it was taken off. But nowadays it's interesting. Our webmaster keeps some stats on various things, and it is one of the more popular products. The cone graphic and the discussion are really the two of the products that get the most number of clicks on an advisory. So a lot of people look at that forecast track and want to see what we're saying about it.
Right.
And then they might move on, which it's good, but sometimes we got to look at the hazard information too.
Right.
But,
right.
It is good that folks are reading the discussion because again, there is additional information in that product.
Well, I remember back in the day when I would print stuff out. I rarely print anything out anymore in the age of PDF and screenshots. That in the 90s, I would print that out. It would say for intergovernmental use only, and I felt like I was special. Like I've got a document that, whatever. I remember that. That's very interesting. Maybe there'll be a Trivial Pursuit Hurricane Edition, and there's your answers right there. All right. Before we leave the, I guess the text products, so to speak, did I miss anything in terms of the written word that we should discuss before we get into the graphics?
The only one I would just mention that there is the text product of is the called wind speed probabilities. A lot of people use the graphics, so you may end up showing the graphic. But again, that product is providing the risk of tropical storm and hurricane force winds at locations both along the coast and inland. It's a very useful product for emergency managers. I actually use it a lot in sort of my personal preparedness. Looking from advisory to advisory to see if my risk of hurricane force winds are going up at my home, my location, what that risk is, and again, it can be pretty useful for decision makers. Again, you got to remember though, there are location specific risks, so they can be quite low, especially for hurricane force, and you might have to take action on a fairly low chance of hurricane force winds.
Right.
But again, the risk is quite meaningful.
All right, so let's move on to the graphics. With the age of the internet, and especially as it's become high speed and the ability to show these graphics in apps and on various and sundry web pages, we have a lot now. We have the cone. People are familiar with the cone, even though they may not be familiar with exactly how to interpret the cone. And we're going to talk about that today. We have the cone with the wind field, right? So you got that addendum on there. Then wind speed probabilities, the arrival time of tropical storm winds, and then other graphics, storm surge graphics, key messages, initial wind field, wind history, all kinds of things. And again, we could talk about this even for an hour or two. So out of all of that I talked about, what would you like to, where should our first stop be? You want to talk about the cone a little bit and maybe understanding?
Yeah, let's start with the cone. I think that's one that most everybody's familiar with, and certainly we're talking about the strengths and weaknesses of the cone. And there is a video that we produced about a year ago with Robbie Berg and John Cangelosi, a couple of my colleagues,
right,
that really get into those strengths and weaknesses. And I'd recommend folks taking a look at that after we finish today, or share it with other folks, because it really does explain what the cone is and what it's not.
All right, so we'll give you a shot at it. So not to take away from this, and I've seen the video, so let's just rephrase it. How best should the public interpret that cone of uncertainty?
So really the best way to look at it is a quick snapshot of where the center of the storm may go. The cone is constructed such that about 2/3 of the time the center is going to stay within the cone. About 1/3 of the time it may go outside the cone. I don't think a lot of people realize that, but that is how the product is constructed.
Right.
One thing that's a real good use for the product is being able to look at the watches and warnings. So you get a feel for where those coastal watches and warnings are in effect. But a couple of things the cone doesn't tell you is it doesn't tell you where the impacts are going to be.
Right.
It doesn't tell you where the winds are going to occur. It doesn't tell you where the storm surge is going to happen, and it doesn't tell you where the rainfall is going to be a problem. Again, not designed to provide that hazard information. Just be provided as a quick briefing tool for someone to look to say, hey, where's the storm headed?
And just focus in on what he said there, folks, that the center, where the center is forecast to be 2/3 of the time, 1/3 of the time, based on statistics, and you go back and you look at what's happened with errors, it's not in the cone. And so a very large hurricane, especially those that are coming up out of the deep tropics that begin to expand in size, and we often see that foreshadowed in the discussion, that the forecaster will mention. The global models are suggesting that hurricane so-and-so will begin to expand in size as it reaches higher latitudes or something like that. That black dot, the center position, is the center of the hurricane. And so people look at that and they go, well, I'm not in the cone. And as Daniel talked about there, it doesn't tell you about the hazards, though, that you could be 1,000 miles away from the edge of that cone at day 5, but as the hurricane comes out, it might be producing swells that come to your beach and causes problems for your family. and the cone tells you nothing about that. So
yeah, we did add just a couple years ago the option to put the initial wind field on the cone,
right,
which I highly suggest people do that, because again it provides some perspective on the size of the storm. And then there are options to include or not include I call it the skinny black line, and that term was essentially came out of Hurricane Charlie back in 2004.
Yes.
And which folks were focused on that little skinny black line, and that was when we then added the option to not show it, and that's really been the default graphic of the Hurricane Center, is to not include the skinny black line. I know folks want to draw that line back in,
sure,
but it is again trying to get away from folks to focus on that exact track, because the Hurricane Center forecast is we've gotten better, but they're not perfect, and so it could move a little left, a little right, a little faster, a little slower than forecast, and folks have to account for that. So we don't want folks focusing on that exact forecast track, especially if you get out beyond about day 2. The uncertainty gets much larger. As forecasts have improved, the cone has gotten smaller through time, because again we're using those statistics from the previous 5 years. One saying I like to say is that the cone's been on a diet, but the storms have not been.
Right.
So the storm size is the same as they've ever been. So as the cone's gotten smaller, it's really making the problem of those hazards extending outside the cone worse and worse through time. Such so that we're looking at things. How can we improve the cone? Can we have another product that's even better? And there's some social science work actually ongoing now to look at how decision makers and others are using the cone by itself, and also in conjunction with some of our other products.
So this product here is one of many. You have added in recent years here storm surge graphics. And what I want to have people understand is there's actually a division, a whole part of the National Hurricane Center, the Storm Surge Unit, that's comprised of storm surge specialists. Maybe that's not the right term, but it's what I know them as. And so there's, that Daniel is not doing the storm surge stuff necessarily, or are you? I mean, when you bring that storm surge information in, is that coming from the Storm Surge Unit? Or are you, how does that work? And we're going to get into the storm surge products from there.
No, that's a really great question. And, again, going back to the advisory, it's signed by one person, but there's a team of folks behind the scenes that are helping. And with the various hazards, we're really focused on the wind. I would say that we're focused on the intensity, the timing of when those winds are going to begin. But we have the other experts like the Storm Surge Unit you mentioned, and I would call them specialists, because those folks are really helping behind the scenes. Right. They're the ones that are doing the modeling, both year-round as well as for that particular storm, to provide both risk maps for emergency managers to understand a location storm surge risk, as well as then once we get into a storm, what is the potential storm surge that particular storm is going to produce. They're the ones that are helping coordinate the storm surge watches and warnings with the local forecast offices and provide that information to me. I help the folks understand, where might the forecasts go wrong? Is it going to go a little further left or right of my track? So we can account for some of those areas in the warning area. But again, they're behind the scenes helping. And then we even have folks at the Weather Prediction Center up in College Park, Maryland, that are providing the rainfall forecast.
Right.
So those folks are the ones that are providing the rainfall information. They're producing those excessive rainfall outlooks to talk about where the flooding rains might occur. And then, of course, the experts out at the Storm Prediction Center are providing that tornado information. So that's what happens on that conference call I mentioned about
exactly.
an hour before each advisory. That's where all these experts are now coming together, talk about these with the local forecast office, talking about with us, and that's where then we begin piecing that information for that public advisory.
Yeah, if you all could understand that, the amount of people that are involved with this, of course, I know this because this is part of what I have done in my career for more than 20 years, but very few people understand that the amount of coordination that goes on is extraordinary, and the products and services have expanded in just the past 5 to 10 years. So now you've got these different text products that we talked about, the public advisory, the forecast / marine advisory is the way I used to know it, the discussion, the wind information, then all of these graphics beginning with the cone and the track. Now you've added on top of that storm surge watch warning. Now there's even storm surge specific inundation maps that show you the different colors, the yellow, the blue, the red. And you can zoom in. It's very interactive. Now you've got the Weather Prediction Center with their rainfall information. That's an incredible amount of people. It's not just one person that's looking at all these different things and putting it all together. Again, I think the way to look at it is that when you see Brown or Bevan or Stewart at the bottom of a discussion, that's the front man of the band. All right? That's the John Bon Jovi of the band, if you will. That's the Bono, okay? The rest of the band is helping to make that music what it is. And that's extraordinary. And now it reaches out across these agencies. And it probably always did, but it's even more evident now than ever before with the coordination with the Weather Prediction Center, the Storm Prediction Center, and now the Storm Surge Unit, and how it has grown. And I'm hoping to be able to get somebody, maybe Taylor or somebody, to come on and talk about, or Jamie, what the Storm Surge group has done and will be doing in the future. Just remarkable. So out of these graphics then, anything new coming up? We love to kind of look at things, and there's a certain amount of seconds that social scientists tell us about how long you have to get a message across. That's in branding and it's almost like you guys need, you remember the show Mad Men on AMC with Don Draper? You need Don Draper as your ad man to come in and how do we sell this to the American public? That's what it comes down to, is this brand that's the National Hurricane Center, and the product is actually products plural. You only have a little bit of time now. Our attention spans are so much shorter. How do you figure out what is the most important message we want to get through regarding a particular situation?
Yeah, you know, each of these products, they serve a slightly different purpose for some folks. And so that's one reason why there are so many. But again, they're serving those specific needs of, say, an emergency manager versus general public. When it gets to the storm surge, you know, we're now producing this potential storm surge flooding map. It's, again, probabilistic guidance that's showing how high the water could reach,
right,
how far inland it could penetrate, again, kind of that reasonable worst-case scenario, something that folks should be preparing for as a hurricane threatens. That product is really geared a lot more toward the emergency manager. And now we have the storm surge watch and warning, which is a more simple, here are the areas that we're most concerned about for life-threatening inundation from storm surge. And so that product, again, is a little more public-facing. You know, if you're in those areas, that's where you got to listen for your emergency manager, see if you're going to be in an evacuation zone. This year, we're actually going to produce a new graphic that's going to highlight or essentially show the areas that we've been mentioning in the public advisory for, you know, the peak storm surge heights in those various areas. So, for example, the public advisory used to say, you know, storm surge of 3 to 6 feet from Palm Beach to Daytona Beach. Now you'll actually see on the graphic that area kind of painted with that 3 to 6 foot range mentioned. So it's a graphical depiction of what's in that public advisory. But again, all of these products have evolved over about the past a decade or so to get into the more sort of hazard base, so that folks can know, how do I need to prepare for storm surge? How do I need to prepare for wind? How do I need to prepare for the heavy rainfall? And again, we're trying to break it down by that, because there are different responses to the different hazards. And again, it helps the emergency managers better prepare.
Well, and that helping the emergency managers prepare, I think there's also a product, and I know that this doesn't originate from the National Hurricane Center, but it's a very important product. And if you could talk about this for a moment, and that's the Hurricane Local Statement. We will see that linked to in and on the Hurricane Center homepage. You'll see like Hurricane Local Statement, National Weather Service Mobile, you know, whatever. And so those, well, I'll let you talk about it. Let's just do that. The HLS, what is it, and how does that get built, if you will, and what can people take away from that?
Yeah, so the Hurricane Local Statement is essentially like a public advisory for a local area. So it's produced by our local National Weather Service offices. It covers their entire area, and it gets down into, you know, the storm specifics, but then it talks about what the hazards are going to be at the local level and what you should be doing for preparations.
Right.
There is some graphics as well called the Hurricane Threats and Impact graphics that provide kind of a range or, you know, extreme a high, medium. They're categorical look at, again, the impacts from wind, from storm surge, from heavy rainfall, tornadoes. I would say those are really fantastic graphics. If people have not looked at those, I would suggest they look at those, because, again, that accounts for some of the uncertainty. So when you see those areas, it's saying, hey, if the storm moves a little left, a little right, this area, could end up with these extreme winds. And so if you're in this area, you should be preparing for those extreme conditions. And it has a description of what we mean by extreme, what the winds could be, what the damages could be. Again, I think those are some fantastic tools that are produced at the local National Weather Service office level. Again, to account for the uncertainty and provide that impact-based information.
Yeah, the hurricane local statement, I often refer to it as, that's the one, as I talk about, okay, look at on the broader scale, you see at the bottom of the forecast, Brown, Bevan, Stewart, etc. But on your local level, you'll see at the bottom of that, I just will pick here in Wilmington at our WFO, the Weather Forecast Office, it might say Armstrong or Pfaff, that's P-F-A-F-F, Steve Pfaff, or Tim Armstrong. That, again, there's a template, of course, but the local impacts are built into and discussed in that hurricane local statement. And what emergency managers say, that all disasters are local when it all comes down to it. You're wanting to know what's happening at your address. Well, we're not quite there yet, but those hurricane local statements are extremely valuable, and they are built on what's happening on the larger scale picture from the National Hurricane Center products and services. So you guys take advantage of those HLS statements. And remember, when you see the name at the bottom, that's not a robot's name or a program's name. That's a real person. And those people live in your community. It's called a county warning area. And I know those can be fairly large, but that's not written from somebody in Oregon for somebody, and I'm not picking on Oregon, I'm just saying for somebody in Charleston, South Carolina. All right? So take that to heart too, that they've got a stake in this if the hurricane is headed to their area. If you see a hurricane local statement for your area, that means that forecaster is probably under the gun from some of those impacts as well, and they're taking it very seriously too. Just keep that in mind. These are real people. All right, so as we wrap, go ahead.
I was going to add to that, Mark, real quick, that
please.
You're exactly right with that. Those local office folks know their local area. That's one reason why with the Storm Surge Watch and Warning, it is a collaborative process, because the Hurricane Center is providing that first cut at the warning area, but it's those local office folks that know whether this bay or this creek or this bayou is going to have more or less surge, and so those folks can help add or subtract some of those areas that they're very familiar with. So again, that's a real collaborative process. We're moving toward probably a more collaborative process when it comes to the wind watches and warnings. Right now, the Hurricane Center is essentially doing the coastal strip, and the local offices are doing those inland areas. Yeah. But we're working toward, I think, a more collaborative approach in the coming years on how to do that warning as well. I'll also add, when you talked about the fact that it's a huge a team that comes together, you got to add in there too the folks that are helping to collect observations during storms. So the men and women of the 53rd Weather Reconnaissance Squadron with the Air Force, the NOAA Aircraft Operations Center, those folks are providing again a lot of the data for us. And then when storms are threatening the U.S., we're often launching extra radiosonde balloons across the eastern half of the U.S. And so you got all kinds of folks at different WFOs helping. I'm sure I would forget somebody, but again, it's a huge team effort across NOAA and even other agencies when a hurricane is threatening to get the forecast information, make the forecast, and then, of course, get the messaging out to everyone.
That's right. Then it goes even further with your ground truth people from companies like Weatherflow that have permanent stations, to the universities that are sending crews out to erect towers, and then even the, quote, hurricane chasers. They do provide, is some of them, you say, well, man, that's pretty crazy. You know what? People film war, for goodness sakes, and we're not necessarily at war with hurricanes, but they do provide. You think of Josh Morgerman, Jim Eds, myself, my group. But at the end of the day, none of us could do any of what we're doing in the field without those products from the National Hurricane Center. And so I'm one of those ones, believe me, that's hitting F5. That's still refresh. Is it there yet? Is it there yet? We're all guilty of that.
I should mention there, Mark, I know everyone wants to see those advisories as soon as they're ready, when they're out over the storms are out over the open ocean, there's a lot less coordination going on. So that's when you see those come out oftentimes, maybe up to a half an hour before, say 11 a.m. Eastern time. But when the big storms are affecting land and there's a lot more coordination, we're coordinating watches and warnings with a lot of the Caribbean nations, Bahamas, others, and so it takes more time. And so that's why sometimes those advisories, and sometimes we're actually waiting on aircraft data.
Right.
We may have another pass through the eye, and we want to get the very latest. So that's sometimes we're waiting on that as well. So be patient when you're hitting refresh. I do it at home too when I'm not on shift, and wondering what my colleagues are saying. So I'm there with you. But sometimes it does just take a little longer.
It does, and we've seen different funny phrases that'll come up from people on Twitter. As a colleague of mine, his favorite is, "They're sitting on the discussion like it's money." Yeah, he knows who he is that says that. And
if you're really watching, one secret is that we tend to send out the forecast advisory first, because it drives everything. And if you ever want to see the quick changes to watches and warnings, those watches and warnings are in there, so you can get a quick look at that.
The secret's out.
It's in the public advisory, the other text product, and the discussion usually is last. Either because we're still reviewing it or working on it, or again, it's not tied to some of the other products. So once we get the other products out, it populates everyone's graphics, TV meteorologists, everyone else. So it's an important product, but it can usually go out a minute or two after the others.
And one more thing about that, we often also start to worry. We're looking, all right, it's 11:01, no discussion. It must be bad. It's going to be bad news. That's where we start speculating. Yeah.
There's been a few times, I'll admit that, with aircraft data, one time was during Hurricane Maria, as it was, this was the intermediate, required a special advisory. But there are times when you are literally waiting for an aircraft data that you feel like there's enough that's changed that you want to wait for that most recent information. And so you might hold on to the products a little bit. There comes a point in time where, if it's getting delayed, you can't wait any longer. You just have to send what you have out. But there are times where we want to get that information. We want to include that information. And it can be a little stressful making sure all that stuff goes out. Because, deadlines are deadlines. We know people are waiting on it. And so it's pretty rare that you ever see a product go out after the top of the hour. But we'll push it right up to that time period if we need to.
I understand. Well, before we let you go, we talked about a few new things that are coming up, but can you just summarize again what's new for 2020? Hopefully it's good, because everybody, 2020 seems at least we never have to do 2020 ever again. But anyway, what's new for 2020, and then long term? I for one don't necessarily know yet if a 6 or 7 day forecast has much utility for the average person, so we may not even discuss that here. But this year and then long term, what can people be looking forward to? What's happening?
Sure. The new things for this year, again, that 60-hour forecast point, that new storm surge graphic that's going to show you what we're mentioning in the public advisory. And then the only other change this year, which might catch a few folks off guard, but really isn't going to change much, is the fact that if you really pay attention to our products, you'll notice that in the Atlantic, we issue products on either Atlantic Standard Time or Eastern Daylight Time, which is the same. And then we also issue products in Central Daylight Time when they're in the Gulf of Mexico. This year, because of products like our time of arrival graphics that provide when the winds might start, those are in that local time wherever the center of the storm is located now. It's a little confusing for folks in the far eastern Atlantic where they're 3 hours ahead of us, or maybe 2 to 3 hours ahead of us. So now when storms are over the far eastern Atlantic, some forms near the Cape Verde Islands, you're going to see it in Cape Verde time. So that 11 a.m. advisory is still going to get issued at 11 a.m., but it's going to say 2 p.m. Cape Verde time in the product header.
Gotcha.
Again, same time. Folks are just going to have to be on the lookout. It's still going to say 1500 UTC. It's the same time for UTC, but folks will see that. And because they're ahead of us in the clock, it might be a little confusing to some folks when they first see that first time or two. But again, we don't issue too many advisories on storms that far east in the Atlantic. And it's also going to be the same case for storms near the Azores. Those are going to use Greenwich Mean Time now.
Gotcha. All right. Well,
but as far as the future, I mentioned real quick. We're still working on the 6 and 7 day forecast in house. I kind of have some reservations about that. The models certainly have gotten better, and those forecasts, the average error of those forecasts are about what the 5 day track errors were a decade or so ago when we introduced those in the early 2000s. But there are the exceptions. There are some rather large errors, and I think we have to be really careful about how we want to present those forecasts in the future. Sure. When we might want to release those. There is a need for those forecasts from some of the groups. Folks like the oil industry that have to make really long-term decisions. Maybe not as helpful for a general household that's living near the coast. Hopefully they can do everything within the 5 day period that we typically have. But again, we are working on that behind the scenes, and kind of we'll see where the social sciences is going to take us and how we might someday issue those forecasts.
Well, speaking of the future, a couple of people have asked on social media, when does the NOAA, we've seen a lot of other forecasts come out, when does the NOAA seasonal forecast get released?
So it'll be issued on May 21st, so a couple weeks, was that 2 weeks away?
Right.
And that's when our NOAA seasonal forecast will get released.
And this week, of course, is National Hurricane Preparedness Week. I encourage you all to visit the National Hurricane Center website. It's hurricaneswithans.gov or nhc.noaa.gov. I don't know how many people know the hurricanes.gov part, but it's true. hurricaneswithans.gov. All kinds of information on there for National Hurricane Preparedness Week. And the folks down there, you all do a remarkable job. This year is, very, very important with all that's going on. If you can talk to it before we let you go, the last question, are there any, as we approach June 1st, it's coming in May 15th for the East Pack, what's the staffing, if you can talk about this, if you can't, I understand, what is staffing like at the National Hurricane Center? Are y'all going to pile in there? You going to do it from home? What's up?
We're going to take things as cautiously as we can. I mean, we want to make sure everyone stays healthy this hurricane season. We'll be ready. We know we have a job to do. And so, folks are looking at how we can socially distance, but make sure that we're ready for this hurricane season. And, right now, many of us have been working from home the last several weeks as we can during this time of year.
Been able
as
to.
you mentioned earlier, a lot of conferences got canceled. So
It's
been a little bit of a change for us in our outreach season. We're doing a fair number of webinars and some streaming events, again, to still get that message out. As you said, hurricane's still approaching. We all got to make our preparations and start thinking about it. And, as a resident here in Florida, I'm certainly doing that, And this is a great week to start being Hurricane Preparedness Week.
Well, I'll add one more then. So I've seen the webinar advertisements and such. Do you know, off the top of your head, how successful that has been in terms of the reach? Has Dennis told you, Dennis Falcon, about, wow, we got some pretty good numbers on the whatever?
Yeah, so we've done 2 webinars with NOAA's Southeastern Caribbean Regional Team, and we've had first week with Ken, our director, Ken Graham, and we had about nearly 500 participants. Today we did one talking about Hurricane Dorian, had director of the Bahamas Weather Service, Trevor Bazin, on.
Right.
And we had about 325 or so. The recordings of those are available. If you do a web search for NOAA's Southeast and Caribbean Regional Team and hit the home page for that site, there's a blurb there about the webinars, and the recordings are being posted there. We've done some webinars or streaming events with folks at the National Tropical Weather Conference. They're doing some online stuff. Jamie did one a couple weeks ago with them that got a lot of views. And I do know that Ken's going to be on there, and I want to say it's May 19th or 20th. And I know Mike Brennan's going to do a presentation next week. Eric Blake's going to do one tomorrow about our use of reconnaissance data. So, again, doing some webinars there. We've been doing the school webinars.
The Hurricanes at Home or something.
And those have been great, too. We've got anywhere from about 200 to up to close to 500 for each of those webinars, and we're making those recordings available, too. So it's great to be able to interact with the school kids that are at home during all of this, and and hopefully teach them a little bit about hurricanes and try to get their families prepared this season as well.
Yeah, and that's the point of this is, we'll have anywhere from 50, 60 to 100 people watch this live, but then you go back in the archives and it lives out on the internet there on YouTube for this. It starts racking up over 1,000, 1,500, and that's important because you think about, you go to a hurricane town forum, and there might be 12 people, I don't know how it is down there, but 12 people come out and you're just like, oh man, it's got to be more interest than this. But the Hurricanes at Home, the National Tropical Weather Conference, what Alex and Tim are doing online, my series with Hurricane U, and there are others, we're reaching more people. I know National Weather Service, Morehead City, Newport did a hurricane Facebook forum, and it just seems like, you look at, like right now, instantaneously, there's 50 people watching. Imagine a room with 50 people in it. I look at that as an opportunity. Again, I try to think more positive perhaps than, oh man, the conferences were all canceled. What a horrible thing. Well, I would say we've actually probably reached more people in the general public this way than we would otherwise do, because we've kind of been forced into it. So there's my positivity for the day.
I'm certainly missing the interaction and
of course.
Being able to see people and have dinner with folks at
right.
some of those conferences. But I think we were really good to be able to pivot. I during the off season, mainly my off season job, but I'm also the one coordination meteorologist at the Hurricane Center. So I organized a lot of our outreach program, and we really tried to pivot pretty quickly. And again, came up with that webinar series and trying to do as much as we can this time of year. We start shifts here in just another about 10 days. May 15th starts the East Pacific hurricane season. So we still got folks doing outreach after that, but we'll be focusing on shifts here pretty soon.
And the first name for the Atlantic this year, you know it off the top of your head?
I can't say I do at the moment.
It's the it's the 2014 list because we didn't retire any off of that one. It was Arthur.
I can't remember.
Arthur's the first one. Yep. Yeah. I was in the eye of Arthur 2014 over Oregon Inlet, which ironically was opened because of a hurricane in 1846. How about that? Story for another day, but Arthur's the first one for the Atlantic. Amanda, if I'm not mistaken, is the first one for the East Pacific. We almost got it, but we had to settle for TD1E instead. So anyway, Amanda for East Pac, Arthur for the Atlantic. Hurricane season's coming. Don't lament at that fact, folks. Hey, look, we have experience with hurricanes. We know them better than anything else we're dealing with right now. Look at it that way. Use our experience to our advantage is the way I look at it. Well, Dan, I appreciate you spending time with me and the rest of us that have tuned in today. Anything you want to add before we let you go?
No, thanks for having me. It was really enjoyable, and let's tell all our friends and family out there to get ready for this hurricane season as best we can.
Yeah, any year you want to do that. This year maybe it's a little bit more than usual with what else is going on. Everybody, thanks for tuning in. I do appreciate it. Just a note, we are supported, like public radio, by members, and we call them patrons on Patreon. It's a crowdfunding resource, global. Lots of people involved with that, and they make this possible so that I can do it for you all. And I really appreciate the patrons from Patreon and that whole concept making this possible. As I said, it mimics what public radio is all about, where you can do stuff for the greater good supported by our members and our patrons. So thank you to all of our patrons out there. In an upcoming, we only have a few more weeks, and then this series wraps up. We will eventually discuss that boring, I know, topic of insurance, but believe me, you're going to want to focus on that because it's very important, and it better not have 12 viewers for that. It's got to still be 50 or more. I'm going to be mad at you. Insurance is extremely important. We're going to talk about storm surge, and then we're going to eventually talk about emergency management, and then I'm almost out of weeks there. And at some point, we do want to talk about local National Weather Service. Maybe we'll combine emergency management and WFO into one Hurricane U episode, and that'll all conclude as we wrap up the month of May. All right, thanks for everybody for tuning in. I'm Mark Suttle with HurricaneTrack.com. I'll see you next week on Hurricane U.